There are moments in a nation's story when ordinary people can feel history shift beneath their feet. And if you were standing anywhere near the dusty lithium fields of Nasarawa last week, you could almost hear that shift like a quiet drumbeat rising from the ground. Men and women paused from their daily work, trucks slowed on red earth roads, radios flickered with a single astonishing report: Nigeria had just said no to the United States. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with a confidence the world did not expect. For decades, Washington believed Africa's largest economy would always play by the old rules. Foreign companies extract the wealth, local communities watch it leave, and the cycle repeats. But this time, when American officials hinted at visa restrictions and a U.S. mining corporation arrived expecting easy approval, Nigeria drew a line in the sand. A simple message echoed from Abuja to Washington: if you restrict us, we will restrict you. If you want our lithium, you will respect our future. This was not just a policy dispute. It was a turning point, a moment when Nigeria decided its children deserve more than the leftovers of its own land. A moment when Africa, once told its resources were meaningless, without foreign hands, finally began to lift its head. And now the world is unsettled. Why would Nigeria reject one of the most powerful nations on earth? What really happened behind those closed doors? And how will this single decision reshape the global struggle for critical minerals, the same minerals powering America's electric cars, satellites, and military technology? Stay with me, because this is bigger than lithium. It is about dignity. It is about sovereignty. It is about a continent rising, the same rise we see echoed in Burkina Faso under leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré, a name many of you following Africa news already know well. If you believe nations deserve control over their own wealth, I invite you to listen closely and to share this message with someone who still thinks Africa cannot stand on its own. Before we talk about diplomacy, geopolitics, or global battery races, we must begin with something far more human: the long memory of a people. For generations, Nigerians have watched the same story unfold again and again. A foreign company arrives with polished boots and polished promises. Heavy machines roll into quiet villages. Surveys are conducted, contracts signed, minerals extracted, and then the profits vanish overseas while the communities who live on the land remain in struggle. Oil, gold, tin, each resource carried its own chapter in this familiar, painful cycle. So when whispers began spreading that Nigeria possessed some of the purest lithium deposits in Africa, many citizens felt a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that this mineral, this white gold powering electric cars, satellites, phones, and advanced military technology, might finally help the nation industrialize. Fear that history would repeat itself. Fear that another foreign giant would walk in, take everything, and walk out. That is the emotional backdrop against which the events of last week unfolded. Lithium is not just a mineral. For companies like Tesla, Samsung, Toyota, Google, and nearly every major defense manufacturer, lithium is the lifeblood of the 21st century. Countries that control it will shape the next industrial revolution. Nations that lose access will spend decades trying to catch up. And beneath the soil of Nasarawa, Kogi, Niger, Kaduna, Ekiti, and Ebonyi lies a resource the world now desperately needs. For years, foreign players knew this before Nigerians themselves did. Geological surveys were funded quietly, drone maps were drawn, samples were exported discreetly for laboratory analysis. And the conclusion was unmistakable: Nigeria was sitting on a strategic treasure. So when a major American mining corporation arrived in Abuja expecting the usual pattern: quick meetings, fast approvals, and long-term control over extraction sites, the assumption felt almost routine. Their team expected red carpets, not resistance. After all, U.S. companies had operated across Nigeria for decades with minimal friction. Many arrived with the mindset that access to African minerals was something of an entitlement secured by influence and history. But something in Nigeria had changed. Inside government offices, officials debated fiercely. Memories of the Niger Delta hovered over every conversation. Decades of oil wealth leaving the country, billions earned by foreign companies, while pollution and poverty scarred the communities who lived among the pipelines. Nigeria knew that repeating that mistake with lithium would be unforgivable. And so, in a moment that will be studied for years, the answer delivered to the American delegation was firm, calm, and final: the permits were denied. The U.S. team was stunned. This was not a negotiation tactic. This was not a temporary pause. It was a declaration that Nigeria's lithium would no longer be exported in raw form for others to refine and profit from. Any company, American, Chinese, European, or otherwise, that wanted to touch Nigerian lithium would have to refine it inside Nigeria, hire Nigerians, and build value on Nigerian soil. As this decision rippled across Abuja, something else happened quietly but powerfully ordinary. Nigerians felt a rare sense of ownership. In mining towns where teenagers had seen trucks smuggling lithium across borders under illegal arrangements, people finally sensed that their country was choosing a different path. Mothers imagined schools funded by local industry. Young engineers imagined working in battery factories rather than dreaming of leaving the country. Elders felt the weight of a historic shift. This was not merely an economic policy. It was the moment Nigeria said no more exporting poverty and importing prosperity. A line had been drawn, a cycle had been broken, and a new identity rooted in sovereignty and self-respect had begun to take shape. The turning point did not happen on a battlefield or in a crowded parliament hall. It happened in a quiet conference room in Abuja, where the American delegation sat across from Nigerian officials, fully expecting a handshake and a signature. They had arrived with confidence, carrying documents, projections, and the assumption that the old rules of engagement still applied. But when the Nigerian side calmly stated that the mining permits would not be granted and that raw lithium would no longer leave the country under any circumstances, the room changed. For a moment, no one spoke. The Americans stared in disbelief as if they had misheard. Nigeria refusing the United States. And not just refusing, but refusing with finality. That silence was the peak of the story's tension, the moment the world unknowingly shifted. When the delegation returned to Washington, their report triggered immediate concern. Lithium wasn't just another mineral to the U.S. It was a strategic asset vital for electric vehicles, battery storage drones, satellites, and even advanced military systems. America's biggest fear was already well known. China controlled nearly 60% of the world's battery supply chain. Losing Nigeria meant losing one of the few non-Chinese aligned sources of high-grade lithium. Within days, analysts briefed congressional committees. Policy experts warned that Washington had underestimated the growing assertiveness of African nations. Business groups lobbied the State Department, arguing that if America didn't act quickly, China would fill the vacuum. Even major U.S. media outlets, which rarely covered African economic decisions, published thinly veiled critiques describing Nigeria's stance as anti-investor, risky, or geopolitically short-sighted. But what they called risk, Nigerians called self-respect. Then came China's reaction, swift, calculated, and opportunistic. While the U.S. focused on influence, China focused on partnership. Almost immediately, Chinese officials reached out to Abuja with a different tone, not demands, but proposals. They offered to build lithium processing plants, train Nigerian engineers, establish research centers, and share technology, something the American company had never placed on the table. In mining communities from Ebonyi to Niger State, the contrast did not go unnoticed. For once, Nigeria had leverage, real leverage, and China knew it. Meanwhile, across Africa, governments watched with a mixture of admiration and awakening. Zimbabwe had already banned the export of raw lithium. Namibia had done the same with rare earth minerals. Congo was tightening its grip on cobalt. But Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, taking a stand against the U.S., sent a different signal altogether. It told the continent that the era of quiet compliance was ending and a new chapter of resource nationalism was beginning. In Ghana, radio hosts debated whether gold refineries should be mandatory. In Kenya, newspapers asked why Africa exported raw coffee and imported finished products. In Burkina Faso, leaders pushing sovereignty like President Ibrahim Traoré found powerful validation in Nigeria's decision. Across Africa news platforms, the event was hailed as a sign that the continent was finally learning to protect its own wealth. But the most important reaction came not from foreign capitals, but from ordinary Nigerians. In Nasarawa, miners gathered around small television sets in village shops, hearing for the first time that the government had blocked the American deal. Many remembered how oil wealth had skipped past their communities, entirely leaving polluted rivers and empty promises. This time, they hoped things might be different. Young Nigerians, engineers, students, innovators filled social media with excitement. They spoke of battery factories, of renewable energy hubs, of finally keeping value at home instead of exporting it for pennies. They expressed pride, not hostility, pride that their country had stood tall, pride that Nigeria could no longer be pushed around. Of course, Washington was not prepared to let the matter rest. Diplomats requested more meetings, investors hinted at withdrawing capital, policy circles whispered about strategic consequences. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable, yet the Nigerian stance held firm, and that firmness became a global headline. What happened in that conference room in Abuja was more than a contract dispute. It was a symbolic rupture, an unmistakable sign that Africa's largest economy was no longer willing to trade its future for short-term favors. It marked the moment global powers realized that the game on the continent had changed. And for millions of Africans watching from near and far, it felt like witnessing the first domino fall in a long-awaited shift toward dignity and independence. The shock of Nigeria's decision did not stop at government buildings or foreign embassies. It rippled outward into daily life, into homes, markets, mining towns, university classrooms, and even among Nigerians living abroad who had long wondered when their country would finally claim its rightful place. This was not merely a geopolitical moment, it was a social awakening. In the mining communities of Nasarawa and Kogi, the change was felt almost immediately. For years, residents had watched trucks loaded with raw lithium rumble out of their villages at night, headed toward borders and ports in deals that offered almost nothing to the people who lived closest to the resource. Young men who once spent long days digging for scraps sold to middlemen for a few dollars now began asking a different question. What if this mineral could build real businesses here? Mothers who had never imagined their children working in high-tech industries started to dream cautiously. Could there one day be a battery assembly plant near their town? Could their daughters become engineers, not just miners' assistants? Could the wealth that left their soil finally return as schools, clinics, and paved roads? These were not fantasies, they were the social consequences of a country, for the first time in decades, choosing to keep value at home. But the decision also brought tension. Illegal mining operations, many previously protected by corrupt networks, began to feel the pressure. Government crackdowns disrupted smuggling routes that had quietly enriched a small circle of traders. Some tried to resist while others rushed to seek official licenses, realizing the era of unregulated extraction was ending. For ordinary citizens, this disruption offered a rare feeling of justice, a rare moment when the government's actions aligned with the people's interests. Politically, the lithium decision reshaped Nigeria's internal landscape. It strengthened the government's image among young people who had grown tired of watching foreign companies dictate the country's economic direction. Many saw the lithium ban as a declaration that Nigeria would no longer be managed from the outside. University students debated the possibility of Nigeria developing a full battery value chain. Professors who had once lectured about lost decades now spoke with cautious optimism about an industrial revival. Yet with ambition came responsibility. For Nigeria to truly benefit, it must build the technical and industrial capacity required to process lithium, not just extract it. That means training chemists, engineers, machine technicians, and renewable energy specialists. It means establishing quality standards, environmental protections, and long-term infrastructure planning. Failure to do this could leave the nation vulnerable to a new form of dependency, even if the partner is China instead of the United States. Internationally, Nigeria's political posture stiffened. Some Western diplomats quietly warned of economic consequences, while others tried to negotiate softer terms. Still, Nigeria held firm. And that firmness resonated deeply across the continent, especially in countries like Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Ghana that had already begun resisting raw material exploitation. But perhaps the most profound impact came in the realm of national psychology. For decades, Nigerians had been told that their country was rich, yet helpless, blessed with resources, yet unable to use them. This decision, simple in form, revolutionary in meaning, challenged that narrative. It told citizens that sovereignty was not a slogan, it was a policy. It told young Nigerians that their country could be a producer, not a spectator. And it told the world that Africa's largest democracy was no longer willing to exchange its future for diplomatic convenience. In a way, the political implications were only a reflection of a deeper civil transformation, a renewed belief that Nigeria's wealth truly belongs to its people, not to those who arrive with promises and leave with resources. From Washington's perspective, Nigeria's refusal was more than a diplomatic inconvenience, it was a strategic alarm. In policy circles, U.S. analysts had long warned that America's dependence on foreign lithium, particularly supplies tied indirectly to China, was a growing vulnerability. When Nigeria drew its line in the sand, it didn't just close a door. It exposed a reality Washington had tried to avoid. America was losing influence over the world's most important minerals. In think tanks across D.C., conversations shifted almost overnight. Reports highlighted that African nations were no longer passive participants in resource negotiations. Congressional staff quietly circulated memos pointing out that without Nigeria's lithium, the U.S. would face even steeper competition from China in electric vehicles and defense technologies. For older policymakers who remembered the Cold War resource races, the implications were unmistakable. A new global contest had begun, and this time, Africa was no longer a silent battlefield. It was an assertive player. Meanwhile, Europe viewed the situation with a blend of anxiety and introspection. Already struggling to catch up in the clean energy transition, the EU feared becoming technologically dependent on Chinese-manufactured batteries. Nigeria's decision intensified this fear. European commentators asked whether the West's approach to Africa centered on extraction rather than partnership had finally reached its breaking point. Some leaders pushed for a new model investment in African industrialization rather than simply purchasing African minerals. But such shifts take time, and time is a luxury Europe no longer has. China, however, understood the opportunity almost immediately. While U.S. officials debated leverage, China offered factories training programs and joint ventures. It wasn't charity, it was strategy. Beijing knew that whoever secured Africa's industrial future would secure the commanding heights of global technology. To China, Nigeria was not just a mineral source, it was a potential manufacturing hub, a partner capable of reshaping supply chains for decades. And unlike past eras, Africa was now negotiating from a position of confidence. Across the African continent, the symbolism of Nigeria's stance echoed powerfully. Countries rich in cobalt, manganese, copper, and rare earths began re-evaluating their export laws. If Africa's largest economy could reject a major U.S. corporation, perhaps the rest of the continent could rewrite its relationships too. In Zimbabwe, commentators praised Nigeria for refusing the old colonial script. In Namibia, ministers argued that Africa's true wealth was in processing, not digging. In Burkina Faso, the sovereignty movement championed by President Ibrahim Traoré found validation in Nigeria's boldness, proof that African nations could dictate terms, not merely accept them. But perhaps the most important global reaction came from the general public, especially older Americans watching these developments with mixed feelings. Many remembered the era when U.S. foreign policy assumed natural access to global resources. Seeing Nigeria stand firm raised uncomfortable but necessary questions. What happens when nations once considered peripheral begin asserting their agency? What happens when Africa stops exporting raw minerals and starts exporting finished products? And what happens when the world's fastest-growing continent demands a seat at the economic table, not just a place on the menu? In this sense, Nigeria's decision was not a rejection of America, it was a rejection of an outdated system. A system that had benefited foreign economies while holding African industries stagnant. A system increasingly incompatible with a world where sovereignty movements from Burkina Faso to Nigeria are rewriting the rules. For global observers, one truth became clear: the balance of power was shifting, and Africa was no longer waiting for permission to rise. As we step back from the dust of the lithium fields and the closed-door negotiations, one truth rises above every detail. You've heard Nigeria has made a decision that carries the weight of history. Not because it solved every problem overnight, and not because the road ahead is free of danger, but because for the first time in a long time, the country chose a future shaped by its own hands. Yet with every bold step comes a warning. The forces that benefited from the old system will not simply fade into the background. Pressure will come through diplomacy, through investment terms, through media narratives that paint Nigeria as unstable or ungrateful. There will be attempts to divide policymakers, to sway public opinion, to stir fear that rejecting foreign extraction means rejecting progress itself. And if Nigeria fails to build the industrial capacity necessary to process and manufacture its own battery materials, the country could slip into a new form of dependency, even if the flag on the partner's uniform changes. But that is precisely why this moment matters so deeply. Across Africa, from Ghana's gold corridors to the copper belts of Zambia, from Namibia's rare earth fields to the emerging industrial zones of Burkina Faso, under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, people are watching Nigeria with a sense of awakening. They are asking whether this is the beginning of a continental shift, a shift where Africa no longer exports raw hope and imports refined disappointment. A shift where dignity becomes part of the economic equation. And beyond Africa, older Americans watching this story unfold might feel a familiar echo, the echo of a world reshaping itself, of new powers rising, of old assumptions quietly eroding. It is a reminder that in a global economy driven by technology, minerals, and supply chains, respect and partnership matter more than entitlement. So the question now is not, why did Nigeria do this? The question is, what happens next, and who will stand with them as they build a future worthy of their resources? If Nigeria succeeds, millions of young people may finally see prosperity created at home rather than exported abroad. If it fails, the old patterns will return stronger and more entrenched than before. And that is why these decisions in fields, in ministries, in quiet meeting rooms are not just political choices. They are choices about identity, dignity, and destiny. As you reflect on this story, I invite you to share your voice. Do you believe that resource-rich nations like Nigeria and Burkina Faso are finally taking the right path toward true sovereignty? Do you think leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré are shaping a new model for African news and the global South? If you feel you are among the first to witness and support this new African awakening, please share this video and subscribe if you believe that the truth should never be hidden behind headlines.